uh, would belong. Oh, now recording. So then that other part of the impact certificate would belong to the sponsors of the wing of the ARC that has basically selected the research object. So that way, we would have a couple of like really nice things. So one of them is that the incentives of the funders and the scientists, they would be aligned. And that would probably mean that for the funders, there is less need for due diligence and for all different sorts of auditing that they normally do and so on and so forth. So, because there is less of a principal agent problem, the incentives are more aligned. So that is one thing. The other thing is that, as I said, it creates a specific reward for the scientists, and it gives them an incentive to actually join the system. And the third thing is that by having these digital assets that actually have a quantitative value, it also creates an additional incentive for sponsors for these wings of the library of knowledge. And it would have this cool side effect that the ARCs that are most productive in terms of churning out really high quality research that ultimately matters for the world, they would produce more of these digital assets, which would mean that the market value of actually being a sponsor for that wing should go up, and they should automatically be able to attract more funding from sponsors. So all of that are sort of like things that I think are actually really exciting and cool. And of course, there is this potential that impact certificates could be traded, right? So the owner or the person that is either sponsoring the wing or the person that has sponsored the science, they could sell the impact certificate at some point if they believe that it's in their benefit to have this exit event. And there could be a flourishing market where these impact certificates are being traded and where people are basically coming in and trying to be arbitrageurs and try to identify profit opportunities and identify research objects or projects that are currently undervalued. And that may actually bring in additional sponsors into science. So these would be people that are not coming there primarily with an altruistic incentive to just donate money to science, but people that come there with a profit incentive and basically act like venture capitalists that are generating a portfolio and contributing to the liquidity of science, and possibly also bring in additional funds that way. So, okay, I'll stop talking now. I'm super, super curious what you guys think and what type of questions or comments you have.
If you're not in a place where you can immediately speak up and ask a question, feel free to post something in the stage. That's where the chat. And actually, if you don't mind, would love to start out by asking a question. Philip, do you see this replacing the existing systems for funding science, complementing them? How does this play into what's current?
So I would see this as complementary to the current system. So I could imagine that the traditional funders of science, so the NIHs of this world and the big foundations and so on and so forth, that they may actually want to experiment with funding projects through our system. So there's various advantages for funders. One of them is that by contributing to this retroactive funding good, they would actually sort of like get a guarantee that at least a part of the money that they're spending is going to be spent on stuff that ultimately had an impact on the world, right? And the real value of the system, so how well the system is going to work, is going to depend to a large extent on how much money there is actually in this pot that will ultimately be dispensed to all these impact certificates. And so I could imagine a system where funders could basically do things that they normally also do, things like calls for proposals or having prices or research contracts in our system, and where when they use our system, we could basically have like a small percentage of the grant money or the prize or whatever they're awarding would basically go into this big pot, and thereby basically through a small contribution from many grants or prizes that are being awarded in the grant in the system, puts a lot of money into that overall fund, and thereby makes this entire system viable. So this is how I'm thinking about it.
So that makes sense. Thank you, Philip. By the way, is this audio any better? I now have headphones in at the moment. Feel free to just type on the stage chat. I guess a question that just came up from the community, are you all aware of optimism? Of the optimism project seems similar to DSAT. Philip, I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, exactly. So I was really happy when I saw the presentation at the Funding the Commons conference from the Optimism guys. So I think what they're doing there, this experiment, is pretty much exactly what we have in mind. It's just that in our context, it would be in the context of science, and it would, there would be a more natural way for projects to get vetted, right? So one of the problems that they had apparently, or that they mentioned they had, was that some of the proposals that came in for being funded as a public good ultimately were not such great proposals, or they actually were not public goods at all. And in our case, there would be this basically this vetting mechanism where a particular piece of research would only get an impact certificate once it's been selected by an ARC, right? So once it has been peer reviewed and basically passed a test of general scientific rigor and so on and so forth. So that would actually solve some of the issues that they had in their experiment. But yes, absolutely. So I would love to talk to some of the people that were involved in that project and just exchange ideas. And there may also be a way for us to just build on that experiment.
Yeah, thank you, Philip, for presenting the idea of impact certificates. So this is an idea. I'm just going to dive a bit more into the history of impact certificate. It comes to us, as far as I know, from the effective altruism community. So I've posted a link to the forum of the effective altruism community. It's an idea that has been elaborated upon by Paul Cristiano and others. It's quite fascinating, and I encourage all of those of you that are interested in learning more about the history and the background around impact certificates to have a look. Interestingly, we've had the Funding the Common conference in New York City, great success. They had wonderful speakers. Impact certificates played a prominent role in many of the conversations that have been here. The question is, of course, always how to give more effectively and how to create systems that incentivize the type of public good generation that can actually benefit and create the more effective funding mechanisms. Now, to play the devil's advocate, I would say that there's challenges surrounding impact certificates. One of them is that we can say that at this stage, they're under-theorized, meaning that we do not have yet viable theories of impact certificates. We haven't done any type of economic modeling based studies, and all of that is essentially a large and emergent field that has a certain potential, and I'm quite bullish about this concept in general. There are other aspects around it which might be counterintuitive. There's a question around impact certificates and in general around retroactive public goods funding. The problem is, how do I know as a funder that had I not invested the money to reward a retroactive public good, that it would have emerged? Meaning, is my retroactive public good contribution a causal factor in the emergence or the creation of a public good, or is it just an incidental reward that is given on top of something that would have emerged naturally. So the question, that is one of the fundamental question, because funders, at the end of the day, want to be able to track and measure the difference they make in the world. And that is quite fundamental to the role of a funder, because funders have to justify their expenditures and their investments into the production of public good. That's fundamental to funders, be it philanthropic organizations who are responsible to their boards, or public funders who are responsible to the public, and other bureaucratic mechanisms that place safeguards on the expenditure of public money. So these are the types of questions that we need to explore as a community. There's other interesting avenues about defining impact certificates. And I think this is an area that is, I would say, in an embryonic stage of theorizing. There's many different ways and angles we can take to operationalize impact certificates. One of them is, for example, the idea of like, hey, we can use impact certificates as a to provide individuals with essentially a token which represents their contributions to the emergence of a certain public good. It could be something like participating in creating knowledge. It could be something into having participated in funding an important breakthrough in science in a post facto way, right? All of this is based on the notion of retroactive public goods funding. There's another approach, which is likewise interesting, which is the idea, well, we can create a prize. Let's say we can say, hey, if there's a, let's say if there's a, we take an ambitious target. Let's imagine, for an instance, create a large language model that allows, to synthesize the scientific literature in a rather accurate way according to certain machine learning benchmarks, right? So this would be the type of prize that would be measurable empirically in a way that cannot be gamed, essentially. And the idea is that, you'd have scientists operating in that space, producing knowledge, producing models, creating all sorts of contributions that might be incremental, some might be quite disruptive. And the idea is that once that benchmark is reached, you would distribute the pot of reward along a graph of knowledge, meaning you would be spreading the rewards of the funders who are naturally risk averse into a graph of knowledge, of interconnected knowledge that might have different degrees of causal impact on unlocking the prize. That type of mechanisms is quite interesting to me, because it allows to flip the preference of funders from risk aversion to the introduction of another intermediary, let's call that person a speculator, who would enter that system and try to speculate on published research and measure the estimated causal impact in the release of the prize in order to be able to get a share of it. And that means we would essentially flip the preference from risk aversion of funders. So funders do not want to waste any money. They want to have something to show to the public. They are we've all seen that through the various discussions on the NIH and other centralized funding institutions, that they prefer incremental, secure improvements and advancements of knowledge over moonshots. And this is a problem, and I think many people in the field of science funding agree that this is a pernicious issue, and that is due to the inherent incentive structures of bureaucracies. And the idea is like, well, now if we allocate, let's say, a prize around finding the causal mechanisms behind Alzheimer's disease, right? Many of you, I'm sure, have heard about the waylaid research in Alzheimer's disease, which has been driven for the past decade or more around the amyloid hypothesis, which is now more and more put into question as the causal factor behind Alzheimer's, right? And the idea is like, well, let's say we create a prize around finding the actual causal factor behind Alzheimer. And we have a certain number of criteria around how to evaluate the rigor and the validity of the fulfillment for these criteria. And now you allow scientists to be producing hypotheses which might be completely out of the existing orthodoxy, right? For example, you could say, well, maybe it has a viral cause, maybe it has, different types of causative agents, and you might have a real plurality of hypotheses and explanations that start to emerge. And as this graph of knowledge builds up over time and converges towards an explanation which converges towards the truth, then you could have a mechanism which unlocks the prize and then distributes that prize along this graph of knowledge. And the stakeholders of these individual discoveries would first and foremost be scientists. But these scientists are faced with a problem. The problem is very simple. They might not have funding today to test the type of hypothesis that they want to put out there. And they might need to have an allowance of funds in order to be able to carry on their research. So now you need to introduce a outside party who's willing to take a risk, to make a bet. Let's say, hey, I'll give you, $200,000 to test out that hypothesis, to collect the data, and to carry out that analysis plan that has been registered in the system. And, if this analysis plan essentially ends up, bearing fruits and having a causal impact on the unlocking of the prize, I am entitled to a portion of that reward. So that's essentially a way to think of impact certificates as a mechanism that allows for composability of funding. Similar to how the VC sphere operates in funding companies, it would create a new sort of incentive with a new exit mechanisms tied to the release of a prize by credible commitments that are made by funders. So these are, just to give you an idea, these are some of the many, many questions and ways to think about impact certificates that have been driving much of our thinking in the sphere.
Thanks, Chris. I see that Lucas is typing out a question right now into the stage chat. I think a lot of what you said there answered his previous question around whether or not this helps publications at the very start. So I'm assuming that that's probably the question that will come in. Once again, if anyone has questions and doesn't want to type on the stage chat channel, feel free to come off mute and just ask.
So in the meantime, I'll take this really interesting question I see in the stage chat. So Aitian asks, in addition to funders, do you see journals utilizing D-size impact calculation over the impact factor from Claravit and the potential benefits of headwinds from competing with such large corporations? So to be very, very clear on this, I do not believe in a monolithic measure of impact. I think this has waylaid science for too long. The reliance on the scholarly attention economy, citation rates, and predicted future citations, which are essentially what it means, for what essentially defines impact factor, has created adverse incentives in the system. What we want to do with DSI, and this is very important, we want to create a plurality of attributes and a plurality of metrics. I think it's very important that we allow for alternative ways to evaluate the rigor and the robustness of scientific findings. What is not done at all today, except in a very, very few minority circumstances, is, for instance, the evaluation of replicability. The idea that following best practices in open science can award you with certain attributes to your research that are often called badges, for instance, from the Open Science Foundation or the Association for Computing Machinery, having a mechanism to credibly evaluate and verify attributes of research to create a plurality of metrics that can then be rewarded by funding institutions and philanthropic organizations according to their own goals, I think is a very promising avenue to breaking the stranglehold of a monolithic measure on the entirety of the scientific record. So Luca is asking about VC-like investment. Wouldn't that mean that you would need to have some sort of ownership on the scientific discovery? Ige, if we think about new drugs, maybe did not hear it. So there's a wide variety of approach right now in the DeSci space. Our colleagues over at Molecule are investigating the viability of IP NFTs to create alternative funding mechanisms. In the context of impact certificates, it's not necessary to think about IP. Because the idea within that model, one of the impact certificate models, to put it more precisely, is that there is a prize that, for example, let's say carbon capture technology, causative mechanism for Alzheimer's disease, or, large language model for accelerating knowledge. These prizes have credible funders that have attributed a certain quantity of money to the achievement of those goals. And the idea behind it is that we can measure the causal impact of discoveries that are interlinked through citation networks that are essentially building up towards the achievement of this goal. And in order to be able to distribute the prize along this graph, and the idea is if you're a VC-like entity, or let's say, a science, you essentially do due diligence on the specific discovery, evaluating its robustness, evaluating its potential impact when it comes to approaching or converging towards the prize. And you have a direct financial incentive from the unlocking of that prize. Let's say there's $1 billion allocated and a portion of that money is distributed through that graph of knowledge. And if you happen to have bought the impact certificate and forwarded the money to scientists to conduct an ambitious study that has proven to be adding, essentially to have brought us closer towards that prize, you would then be able to carry on a portion of that prize as your profit over your investment, right? So the idea of the prize-based impact certificate does not require anything like IP, copyright, and all of these dimensions. It's not mutually exclusive. You can imagine a situation in which you have both, but it is not a necessity.
So one question that I have on that, Chris, if you do have both, is the impact certificate also including the intellectual property, or are those still two separate entities?
I would still keep them as separate entities. I mean, we don't want to bundle things that don't need to be bundled together. I think that's a good principle of system and mechanism design. So the more to create composable systems, we want to have systems that hold on their own. So I would imagine that these systems would evolve in parallel and perhaps even at different stages, right? You could imagine preliminary research stage in which there's no IP whatsoever generated. In the later stage in which there's more operational research conducted that may or may not lead towards valuable IP. So I would say this as a separate track, but again, these are just my intuitions for the moment. But I would see this as I would simply sum it up as like you don't want to bundle things in a way that makes them harder, less legible, right? That's it.
Way you guys are thinking about impact certificates, especially with the plural nature. I saw a really cool talk this past weekend, and it seems like DeSci Labs is totally on the cutting edge of impact certificates. That was about like how do you determine the amount of the certificate? And they had like a few. It was a talk called like hyper certificates, and it was like looking at certificates as a hyperstructure along multiple axes. And it was like some of the axes they looked at was like the time the work happened, the scope of the work that happened, the time of the impact, the scope of the impact. And I'm wondering, as you guys are thinking about this, what are like the different axes you're focusing on in the impact certificates for measurement, and then for like determining the impact certificate amount, and maybe If I can, I'll try and dig up a link to the talk and share that as well. It was pretty cool. You might like it.
Yeah, great question. We haven't thought much about the different dimensions of evaluation. The one that is most important is evaluating the essentially the good being produced, right? The causative plus that has been added into the world as a result of the creation of this public good. And this is a complex topic. Evaluating that, especially at the moment of issuance of the impact certificate, is quite difficult. That's why, there's this, even in the context of retroactive public goods funding, there's this idea around retroactive public goods funding that it is much more legible to allocate funds to a public good that has been created after its creation, because that is the moment where you can measure its impact into the world. Well, there's a bag of worm associated with that. And the problem is maybe certain type of public goods actually require even quite a long time to express their full potential and their full causative impact into the world, meaning that retroactive public goods funding, let's just say, after a paper is published, after a piece of code is out there, after an invention has been put out there into the wild, might just not be the moment where legibility is maximum. It could be that legibility or the real impact of a public good is actually measured perhaps months, years, or even decades after its creation. So I think that's a point people have to think about very carefully. Is we all agree that retroactive public good funding is a more legible mechanism to allocate funds. The question is, what is the right time span, and what are the cutoffs we should think about?
Yeah, totally. I totally agree. So the timeline is definitely one of these dimensions where we can play around and actually think about different mechanisms. Another obvious dimension where we need plurality is really about how impact itself is going to be measured. And again, I think there is a possibility for a lot of different approaches, and there's also a possibility for us to run natural experiments in the system where we assign these algorithms randomly to impact certificates and then measure the differences between these algorithms. There's also a possibility of literally generating a control group, right? So where you can then basically have one control group where they just would not participate in the normal or in the other mechanisms how the funding is actually being made retroactively available. So there's a lot of different ways how we can experiment with that. But like Chris said, so this is all very, very early stage, and there is a lot of room for serious theorizing and simulations to be carried out to get a better grip on which systems may actually work and what are the critical parameters of such a system.
Yes, and I guess one of the questions, and it's also a point where I'm excited to be collaborating with our community here, is what is the minimal actionable unit of an impact certificate which is credible enough to create a market of a couple of $1 million, right? What is the minimal actionable unit of an impact certificate? And I would love people to just spend some time, think about it. Could it be that we can do impact certificates as simple then let's say giving an impact certificate to someone who has provided funds to curate a particular DeSci research object? Is that a credible enough, actionable, minimal impact certificate? Or should we take on greater ambitions? Understanding essentially the faster we can begin with these experiments with a credible system that adds value and that has demonstrable impact, the better. We want to be able to move fast with these experiments, and I'm really curious to hear what you think about that.
One of the things that pops into my head immediately is patient data records. like if maybe just like another way of stating, like if you take part in a clinical trial, you can earn sort of an impact for your help in finding a cure. And I think of this one immediately because um, if Philip, you brought up that difficult question of like how do you measure impact? And one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is like it's so subjective. Like what's impact to one person might not be impact to another. But in medicine, at least, it can be kind of simpler because if you're a patient and somebody develops a treatment, that's going to impact you, and so you can determine that impact on yourself. And I'm wondering how maybe like thoughts like that, especially around medicine, might be like the most um, theoretically straightforward way to start conceiving of the impact. Curious what you think.
Oh yeah, the question of medicine is a tough one. The problem is, by the time a drug comes from preclinical trial studies to on the market, we are talking years, if not a decade, and hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't know the exact figures, but it's extraordinarily difficult to put a drug on the market. You have to show efficiency above and beyond the current state of the art, and there's many red tape, and for very, very good reason, that is made out there to do that. I think like perhaps one of the most cases is, let's say, proving a conjecture in mathematics, right? So you have prizes for proving these mathematical conjectures. Mathematicians would, laugh a bit and say, well, those are just to get people to study math and essentially as a marketing mechanism for mathematics study. But yes, they are prizes for, let's say, you've solved the Riemann hypothesis, which was solved, I believe, some not too long ago. And there's $1 million prizes associated with these, some of these accomplishments. So mathematics is a very clear case of a yes or true or false dichotomy. Whereas treatments and other essentially interventions in complex biological systems are often, necessitate, fine statistical analysis of, effect sizes, comparison with control group, randomized control trials, all of these things which can take a much longer time. But to go back to your point, I do believe that you raise a very important fact that patients themselves have an interest in showing that within their patient communities, they have made an impact. So we could imagine a case, let's say, take a rare disease and you create a system where scientists are incentivized to, publish research in certain directions to essentially address, in a very hypothetical way, mechanisms, that which we can essentially make a difference on that disease, right? So like by studying, chemical pathways, by understanding, the microbiological structures of interactions of different proteins. And you can imagine that patient communities would be very interested in essentially owning the impact certificates of the pursuance of these very early hypotheses, without necessarily having down the road a proof that this has helped me, right? It's more about this has the potential to help my community, to help the people that have suffered from this rare disease along my side, and I can prove to my community that I have made a difference potentially in the long run. So I think that's a very interesting angle to it, because patient groups are inherently motivated, and for very good reason, to foster research in the domain of rare diseases, which are extremely often neglected, both by scientists and also by the pharmaceutical industry.
Yes, 100%. And I'm so excited by what this impact certificate market could do to just align those incentives that people have already into a system where they're more productive towards getting things done that actually help people and make those impacts. And I wonder if question that almost kind of takes it the other aspect of leaning away from the impact is like, and feel free to say this might be a conversation for another time, but I'm thinking about like how impact certificates are really great for like this retroactive awarding of things that have shown impact. And I'm curious what you guys think about the other side of that, of the prediction market aspect of saying, maybe you're a patient who really wants to see a cure for X disease, and there's such and such models running that you could select which one you want to predict will succeed, and would that incentivize you to be a participant in that in the success of that treatment or experiment?
Yeah, big time. So here, I understand you're taking like the prize approach to the impact certificate. So imagine there's this big pot that says, solve, improve quality of life for people that suffer from rare disease X, right? And so as a member of a patient group, you could either directly contribute to that pot with your patient group, meaning you could pool resources together as a DAO, for instance, right? Use these coordination mechanisms to pool resources to incentivize the production of a graph of knowledge that would converge, ideally, towards the resolution of the condition for unlocking the prize. So that is one thing, right? That is the credible commitment that is made at the level of the prize. And now you can imagine another, let's say, subpopulation of patients within those groups could say, well, you know what? I'm risk seeking, and I'm also interested because I'm an expert. I'm a deep expert into this medical condition. I know the literature extremely well. I believe I have an edge as to predict what type of discoveries and what types of hypotheses will lead us closer towards the achievement of this milestone. And therefore, I now take an active role in sponsoring analysis plans that have been posted to pursue certain types of hypotheses that I believe are high leverage in the specific in their future expected causal impact on unlocking that prize, right? So I would essentially advance money to scientists to conduct these analysis plan, and then I would earn a position on the cap table of that impact certificate. Let's just take a number. Let's just assume 50%. That means the day that prize is unlocked, assuming a portion of assuming that the discovery you have invested in has a causative role on the unlocking of that prize. Now, as an investor, you would get a return on investment, right? So these are the two ways you could enter that system. You could enter that system creating a credible commitment on a prize, or you could enter that system by essentially making a bet on an analysis plan that has been posted by scientists.
Does that create then like a rating of impact guarantee? For example, if you make that bet on that prize, or if you join in early on, would someone maybe want to, someone who wants a share of a prize when it succeeds, would then want to like buy that credential off of you that says, you contributed to the impact of such and such project?
So yeah, so buying the credential off of you, I think, is something that would fit better with the other model of impact certificate, which is, a publication brings forward a hypothesis that you believe is valuable, therefore I buy the impact certificate for its curation or, for its funding. Now remember, science is funded by funders. It's incredibly capital intensive, depending on the fields of science, and this is what funders do. They accumulate impact certificates of the science that they funded, and they measure the value of their impact certificate portfolio according to monolithic markers such as the impact factor and citations accrued over time. So this is what funders do. Now you could imagine a role for people to play, patient groups or others, in collecting impact certificates for curating, right? So for example, for sponsoring a scientific society, an ARC, to curate a plurality of attributes or provide peer review services on a particular object of knowledge. And you could essentially take credit for having done that, and you would then own that impact certificate. And now let's imagine you're in a market where early comers generate more value And you can imagine all sorts of mimetic engineerings that would follow from that, creating speculative incentives for people to buy and potentially flip those impact certificates. Now, that being said, there's also an argument to be made that these should not be speculative tokens. In the sense, you can read actually on the Effective Altruism forum, there's this absolutely genius person called Guern under his pseudonym who says, you know what? Perhaps you don't want people flipping impact certificates like they flip 8 pictures, right? What you would rather have is, let's say, an incremental price mechanism where someone who wants to buy it off you just has to pay more. And you could essentially mitigate, you can essentially create mechanisms to transfer these impact certificates between people in a way that both provides potential financial upsides for the original owners, but also mitigate let's say the exuberance that can be tied to speculative that happens in and out in different moments of a financial cycle.
Yeah, definitely don't want people flipping these like 8 pictures. That makes a lot of sense to me. Thank you.
So we have a fantastic comment here from Flow Science. Reading through it. Yeah, I just want to say I'm very grateful for all of you and this community. I think you are all bringing tremendous value to the community with your questions and commentaries. So guys, just keep at it. It's just absolutely wonderful to see, and I couldn't be happier than just hanging out with you guys once a week here and talking about all of these things.
Same here.
It's fantastic. And with that being said, I think we're getting towards the end of our community call time today. So would encourage everyone to continue this discussion in the funding channel under the scientific discussion category. A lot of great questions that have come up from this community call, and thank you to everyone for asking. As always, this will be posted on YouTube. Make sure to come in and say good morning. And yeah, if you want to be an alpha tester, send me a DM and make sure that you've submitted your email through nodes.dsci.com. And with that, unless anyone else has anything to add, I think that's pretty much it for the day.
Thank you, Eric, for organizing as always. Thanks for everyone who came in to listen to us.